Samburu Reserve, dawn. A female elephant stood pressed against the outer fence of the protected corridor, her head low, her breath shallow. There were no visible wounds, no blood, no broken movement or sign of physical trauma. But she didn't move. Not from the sound of boots nearby, not from the low murmur of the wind through acacia branches. Her eyes were wet. Not from dust. She was crying. Ranger Dodd had been the first to see her during the perimeter check. He kept his distance, his steps slow and angled. The elephant didn't flinch. She didn't charge. She didn't even shift her weight. Only her ears moved now and then, soft sways like tired leaves. He radioed it in. Another ranger, Kamari, arrived 20 minutes later, walking the last stretch instead of using the quad bike. They stood together in silence for a time. Her eyes blinked once, slowly. Then nothing. The fence was old but sound, strung loosely between thick wooden posts. It wasn't electrified, just a soft boundary between the open plain and the shallow woodland beyond. On the other side of the fence there was only emptiness, dry ground, scattered grass, and a few distant hoof prints. The elephant kept her trunk near one post in particular. The wood was rubbed smooth in a low arc just above the ground. Her trunk sometimes hovered there. Not touching, just remembering. She made no sound except a faint exhale that shivered through her chest. Then a low rumble, barely audible, more vibration than voice. Kamari crouched down quietly, resting on his heels. "She's not injured," he said. Dodd nodded. "But something's wrong." That much was clear. The stillness wasn't natural. An elephant alone near human borders usually meant trauma, separation, confusion, and loss. But this wasn't the disoriented pacing of a separated calf or the aggressive posture of a wounded matriarch. This was grief, or something like it. Kamari scanned the brush behind her. No herd. No tracks within the sanctuary that matched her recent passage. Only faint depressions near the outer bush path, likely 2 days old. A wide body had lingered there. Then another set of tracks, lighter, smaller, almost erased by wind. The prints didn't return. The elephant moved at last. She took 2 slow steps sideways, keeping her flank against the fence, and leaned her head gently back toward the smoothed post. Her ears lifted for a moment at the sound of Kamari's breath, then settled again. Her skin was caked with old mud, but she hadn't wallowed recently. No signs of feeding, no dung piles nearby. She hadn't moved from this spot in at least a day, possibly longer. Her body wasn't starving yet. But if she stayed, she would weaken. And if she left in this state, she might not survive on her own. Either way, the risk was growing. Dodd wanted to radio for backup to call the vet team. But Kamari raised his hand. "Let her be for now," he murmured. She wasn't ready. Not to be touched. Not to be helped. Not yet. Kamari knew something wasn't random here. She wasn't lost. She had come to this spot for a reason. They set up camp that evening 20 meters back. No artificial lights. No movement after dusk. Kamari stayed seated for hours, watching from the edge of the thorn tree line. The elephant didn't move through the night. She didn't sleep. Only once did she shift her trunk again toward the fence post, brushing it faintly as if trying to wake something buried beneath. By morning, her eyes were wet again. The rangers noted it in the log, not sure how to phrase it. Elephant showing signs of stress, prolonged stillness, and persistent position at boundary. But Kamari didn't need the words. He had seen this kind of waiting before. And if she stayed much longer, the outcome would change. If she stopped eating, she would collapse. If she left panicked, she would vanish into terrain too vast to follow. If she remained silent, they might never know who she had come for. The elephant had moved only once in the last 4 hours. A slow curved walk along the fence line, her feet dragging slightly, her shoulder leaning into the wood as if testing for memory. When she reached the southern post, then worn smooth where her trunk had lingered, she topped again and lowered her head. Her body swayed gently, not with sleep, but with the quiet motion of holding on. Kamari stood beneath the shade of a fever tree, 20 meters back, arms crossed loosely. He had remained close since the morning check, long after the others rotated out. It wasn't just her refusal to move that struck him. It was the way she moved when she did, deliberately, repetitively, not lost but drawn. There was no urgency in her body, but no peace either. Only a rhythm, like someone tracing the edges of an old path they used to know. The sun had climbed higher. The ground baked quiet. From time to time, her trunk would lift, noting just enough to reach the same patch of air near the fence post. Once it curled inward softly, then fell again. She hadn't fed. She hadn't called. And when wind passed, her ears didn't react. The reserve was still. Her presence made it more so. Kamari moved slowly to sit on a worn rock just off the game path. He didn't speak, but he watched. Her ribs rose with a long breath. She turned once more and began her slow walk north, only to circle back again. It was the third time she'd made that loop since sunrise. Always returning, always lowering her head at the same place. There were no other signs. No dung trails, no scent marks, no vocalizations that would suggest an orphaned calf or a missing mate. But Kamari didn't need the signs. He had seen this kind of stillness before. Not in the wild, but in holding pens after a failed rescue. He had seen animals walk to the edge of confinement, waiting for the voice that had once calmed them. The elephant stopped. Her left foot trembled slightly before she pressed it down. Her tail didn't flick. Her mouth hung slightly open. Kamari exhaled slowly through his nose. She wasn't just confused. She was holding on to something exact. He spoke softly, mostly to himself. "She's waiting." Dodd had rejoined him, quietly passing a flask of water before sitting beside him. Kamari didn't drink. He watched the elephant again as she shifted her weight to one side, pressing her body against the post. Not enough to break it, just enough to feel it, as if it had once meant something, as if someone had once been there. Kamari pulled out the old logbook from his satchel. The sanctuary kept records from years back, names, eights, rescues, and deaths. He flipped past his own notes, down to the second page from the end. There had been a calf brought in near this quadrant 2 years ago. Small female, burn injuries, survived a few weeks in holding, then gone. The handler assigned had been temporary. No name listed. Kamari remembered the fire. He remembered the smell. And he remembered walking away before they loaded the calf's body onto the cart. He hadn't known the mother had survived. He looked back at the elephant now. Her eyes were closed. Her trunk rested on the fence post, not limp, but purposeful. She was not asking for food, not asking for help. She was waiting for someone, not anyone. Someone known. The risks had shifted. If they pushed her, she might panic and bolt. If they left her, she might weight herself into collapse. But if she was right, if Amori had led her here, then here was still time. Time for recognition. Time for a reunion, Daden, or closure. Kamari stood and walked a few steps forward. Not close, just clear. Her ears twitched once. Her trunk lifted, then fell again. She hadn't come for rescue. She had come for a return. The clouds had been gathering since late morning, heavy with the weight of the season's first real storm. The air thickened. Birds went quiet. Low thunder rolled across the reserve in distant, muffled waves. The elephant had not moved from the fence post. Her body leaned slightly now. Ribs more visible with each breath. Legs locked stiff in quiet fatigue. Her trunk hung low, tracing circles in the dust. Not searching. Simply oving because stillness would have meant surrender. Kamari watched from the tree line, one hand resting on his thigh, the other curled around the edge of his notebook. He hadn't written anything in over an hour. The same name sat half-formed at the top of the page. A name he had only said once, years ago, when the calf still had breath in her chest. He hadn't spoken it since. The first drops fell large and spaced, tapping dry soil like fingers against stone. The elephant lifted her head once, blinked against the change in light, and then lowered it again. Then the rain came harder, fast and unbroken. Within minutes the ground began to run. Puddles formed along the path and the base of the fence. The elephant didn't retreat. Instead, she folded her legs, slowly, almost carefully, and dowered her body to the ground beside the post. Her flank met the earth with a soundless sigh. She did not close her eyes. Her trunk lay curved beside her, water collecting in its quiet bend. Kamari stepped forward now. Only once the thunder passed. His boots sank slightly with each step, but he didn't hurry. He walked as if returning to something left undone. The others had remained behind. This was not a team decision. It was his. He had once held the calf's body in his arms, a hop too small for its mother's strength, too quiet for its own breath. He remembered the way she had cried just once after the calf's body was taken, then disappeared into the northern brush before the fire's smoke had even cleared. Until yesterday, he hadn't seen her again. The elephant shifted as he approached. Not away, not toward. just enough to show she noticed. Her ears moved slightly. The tip of her trunk quivered. Kamari stopped a few meters from her side, lowered himself to the soaked earth, and waited. He looked at the post, then at her, then at the place between them. Layla, he said, barely more than a breath. Oh. The name felt unfamiliar in his throat, but not in the air. The elephant didn't raise her head. But her trunk moved, slowly, without pause, until it stretched just far enough to touch the post between them. She held it there. Not for balance, not for scent. Just contact me. Kamari closed his eyes for a moment. He didn't speak again. He didn't reach out. But something in the rain changed. It softened. The weight of it remained, but the harshness faded. The space around them seemed quieter than before, despite the weather. The elephant did not cry. Her eyes remained open, unblinking, but she did not move away. She had heard him. What came next would not be easy. If they intervened too soon, they risked panic. If they waited too long, her strength might fail entirely. She had not fed in over 2 days. She had not moved from this place in nearly 3 years, but she had responded. And that meant something had shifted. Kamari stood slowly, rain sliding down his arms. He didn't retreat. He remained where he was, the name still resting in the air between them. The elephant stayed at the base of the fence, unmoving, water streaming over her broad back, ears pressed low. Her body was still, but not in defeat, in memory. The kind of stillness that waits not for help, but for a moment to pass from what was lost into something living. She did not rise, but she did not turn away. By the 3rd morning, the rain had passed but left the land dark with moisture. The earth beneath the fence was soft and deeply marked by the elephant's weight. She hadn't risen since the storm. Her body lay curled gently around the old post, trunk resting in a curve near her mouth, legs folded with quiet restraint. She had not eaten. She had not moved more than a few inches. But her eyes had opened with the dawn, and that was enough for Kamari to stay. The other rangers had grown more concerned. Dodd had spoken plainly that they couldn't wait much longer. A call to the veterinary team had been delayed again, out of respect, but the window was closing. If she collapsed fully, sedation wouldn't be safe. If she panicked, they would lose her. The risk of dehydration was climbing. The longer she stayed silent, the more the weight of her stillness became a threat rather than a choice. Kamari stood with them now beneath the canopy near the storage shed, his shirt damp from kneeling near her for hours. He hadn't said much until now, but he spoke slowly, carefully, as if the words had taken years to surface. He told them what he remembered. Not all of it, just enough. The calf had been found near the river after a fast-spreading bushfire 3 seasons ago. Alone, limping, her left ear scorched and curled at the edges. Kamari had been the handler assigned, temporarily, why, just for the intake period. The calf had been barely 6 months old, still unsteady, but alert. She had called often, short, sharp cries in the holding pen. Her eyes had always searched the tree line. Even when her burns had begun to heal, she never quieted. She waited for something, someone. For 5 days she waited. And then on the 6th, her lungs filled with smoke that had lingered in her system. She fell asleep standing. She didn't rise again. Kamari had buried her body on the southern slope. He hadn't stayed for the report. He hadn't checked the nearby bush paths for a mother. There had been too many fires that week and too many calves in holding. He hadn't known which herd she belonged to, but now he knew. He looked at the elephant lying beside the fence and understood what she had carried. Not confusion. No injury, memory. Dodd listened without interruption. One of the younger volunteers looked away, eyes fixed on the horizon. There was no blame. But there was weight. Kamari's voice didn't shake. She came back here, he said quietly. Not by accident. No one answered. They didn't need to. Later that afternoon, Kamari brought water closer to the fence, pouring it slowly into the shallow dip where the ground met her front foot. She shifted slightly, just enough to nudge the earth. Her trunk followed after a moment, pulling a small stream of muddy water toward her mouth. It wasn't much, but it was a decision. The first one. He sat again a few meters away, resting his hands on his knees. Her flank lifted and fell with a slow, deep rhythm. He could see the wear in her joints and the way her skin had dulled with time and hunger. But her gaze was steady. Her ears moved with faint attention now, catching the soft rustle of the grass and the occasional cough of a bird far off in the thorn trees. The bond between them had not been built. It had been broken and then buried. No choice, but by fire. By smoke and time and the absence of any path to return, she had found it again on her own, quietly, without warning, and waited for him to remember. Kamari remained with her until nightfall. He said nothing else. The others watched from a respectful distance. When darkness came, she lifted her head for the first time in 2 days. Not high. Just enough to see the shape of the man who had once held her calf's final breath. She did not call, but she did not lower her head again for a long while. By dusk, the light had turned a soft amber, broken in places by drifting bands of dust stirred from the far edge of the reserve. The heat had eased. Wind moved again through the thorn bush and low grasses, pressing gentle currents across the clearing where the fence ran east to west in a crooked line. The elephant stood now, back on her feet after nearly 2 days resting in the same hollow. Her rise had been slow, measured, no signs of urgency, just the quiet insistence of a body choosing not to give in. Kamari had not spoken for hours. He knelt in the same place where he'd sat the evening before, elbows resting on his knees, spine curved forward in fatigue. His shirt clung to his skin, dried sweat drawing pale outlines across his shoulders. The others had rotated out, tending to the path cameras or checking the watering points to the north. He'd stayed, not by assignment, but because something between them had shifted. Not in words, not in certainty, but in presence. The elephant had not walked far, only to the fence, only to the same post where her calf had once stood crying behind wire and canvas, eyes straining for the shape she could no longer find. Now it was she who returned to that place, not with grief, but with the slow persistence of recognition. Her skin bore faint marks from old wounds, patches of hairless tissue along her side where the fire had touched her once, long ago. They were healed now, but not forgotten. Kamari watched her lean again. Not heavily, just now to brush her shoulder against the worn wood. Her trunk hung low, curling once near the ground before lifting halfway, hovering uncertain in the air. She took a step closer to where he knelt. Not fast, not cautious either. Her ears flicked gently, not in agitation, but with the slow rhythm of awareness. There was no fear in her, only effort. She moved again, just half a pace, and then her trunk rose a final time. No tie, not commanding, but quiet and deliberate. It paused in the space between them. Kamari didn't flinch. He lifted one hand, palm open, steady. The wind carried only silence. Her trunk came forward and settled against the curve of his hand. No pressure, no grasp. Just weight, just warmth. He exhaled through his nose, low and even, and let his fingers close gently over the side of her skin. Neither moved. Behind them, a light breeze passed through the brittle grasses. A single bird called once and fell quiet again. Her eyes, soft and round beneath the weight of age and memory, blinked once and held. She did not cry. For the first time since she had arrived, her face was dry. The fluid that had lined her lower lids had stopped pooling. Her breathing remained slow, but her stance had changed. The tension that had lived beneath her shoulders, subtle shudder in her flank, the tremor in her front foot, Hedone still. The contact between them didn't last long. Just long enough, Kamari withdrew his hand as gently as it had been offered. Her trunk dropped again, curling inward near her chest. She shifted slightly, adjusting her weight as the sun fell further toward the western ridge. There was no triumph, no miracle, only a moment of stillness shared between one who had lost and one who had left. They did not speak. But something had passed between them, not in language, not in thought, in essence, impatience, in the absence of force. The light continued its descent across the plain. Shadows deepened behind the fence, stretching eastward toward the dry riverbed. Kamari remained kneeling, eyes low, hand resting softly on his thigh. The elephant stood beside the post, unmoving now, her body quiet against the fading gold of the day. Night came softly, the kind that settled without sound. The last light faded behind the low hills in the west, casting the land in a muted wash of silver. Thin clouds hung still in the sky, untouched by wind, as if holding their breath. Kamari sat with his back to a low rise, watching the elephant rest beneath the same post where her journey had ended, or begun again. She hadn't left that space in hours. Not since the moment her trunk had met his hand. Her breathing remained steady. Her feet tucked beneath her body, knees folded in close. The kind of posture elephants take not in sleep but in waiting. Her eyes opened from time to time. She watched the shadows. She listened. Not for him, for something else. Kamari didn't move. He had grown used to the silence, the soft rhythm of her presence. She was no longer crying, but she wasn't done either. There was something unfinished in the way she tilted her head every few minutes, the way her ears paused at slight sounds beyond the fence line. It began with one low rumble. So distant it could have been thunder. But it wasn't. Then another, closer. Then three. Slow pulses, layered through the trees coming from the north ridge. Kamari sat up straighter. The elephant didn't move. Her body tensed slightly, ears angling forward. Her trunk lifted just enough to pull air from the windless dark. Then she exhaled long and low. The calls grew closer. Not fast, not loud, just steady, unbroken. Shapes emerged from the distant scrubland, faint at first. 5, then 7. A small herd, their silhouettes barely distinct from the night itself. No heavy footfalls, no commotion. Just movement, organized and deliberate. They paused some 30 meters from the fence line, silent now, their heads turning in quiet unison. One matriarch moved forward. The others waited. Kamari's hand hovered near the radio but didn't reach for it. This was not a moment to mark in reports. It was one to witness. The elephant beside the fence shifted her weight, rising slowly with stiff limbs. She did not trumpet. She did not call back, but her ears opened wide and her trunk curled upward for just a second before falling again. The small herd remained still. Then, from behind the outer line, a young calf stepped forward. Too small to lead, too unsure to walk alone. But it moved anyway, passing through the legs of the older females, pushing against the edge of the clearing. Kamari watched the calf approach the fence. It hesitated once, stepping over a fallen branch. Then again when its foot sank slightly in the wet soil. But it kept coming, pulled by something not taught but known. It reached the post. The older elephant did not lower her head. She stood upright, watching with the stillness of something remembering too deeply to speak. The calf brushed past her flank, not stopping, just touching, a soft movement like wind folding through grass. Her trunk lowered in response, not to embrace, not to lead, just to feel. She didn't follow the calf. Not yet, but her posture had changed. The stillness that once meant sorrow now held something else. But maybe, or peace. The herd waited. They didn't push forward. They didn't call again. They allowed space. The matriarch turned once, her body angled to the open ridge, and stepped back into the dark. The others followed. Not away, just deeper. The calf lingered a moment longer beside the post, looking once toward the man kneeling in the distance, then back to the figure beside it. Then it too turned. The elephant remained at the post until the last shape vanished into the trees. She didn't chase. She didn't cry. But she stood taller now. Her weight is more centered. Her silence was no longer empty. A breeze lifted briefly across the fence line, stirring dry seed pods along the ground. Kamari rose, dust clinging to his knees. The night had changed. She wasn't waiting anymore. She had been seen, and something in the herd had answered. Morning brought a stillness that was not empty but full. The sky was pale, threaded with streaks of light where cloud and heat met without storm. Dew clung to the lowest brush, and the air smelled of softened soil, worn bark, and ash long settled. The elephant stood beside the post, alert but unmoving, as she had so often done in days past. But something in her frame had shifted. There was no tension now in the angle of her legs, no hesitation in the curve of her spine. She stood as one who knew where she would go, but not yet. Kamari waited quietly beneath the tree line, his hands loose at his sides, his body still recovering from the night. He had not slept. The moment when the calf brushed beside her had not left his thoughts. Not just the action, but the choice it had invited. He knew elephants did not mourn in ways humans could map, but they held patterns of memory, invisible enes drawn between sound, place, and movement. And she had come here, not only to remember her calf, but to meet something else. A return, perhaps. A threshold. She turned, slowly at first, shifting her weight off her left leg. The stiffness in her step was visible, but not limiting. Her trunk swung wide and low, tracing the shape of the grass before her. Behind her, the fence remained as it had for years. Weathered, arrow, neither barrier nor guide. She stepped past it. The calf emerged from the far edge of the clearing, walking in short, deliberate movements, ears twitching slightly at each bird call or shift in light. It followed without sound. No call passed between them, but their paths crossed in quiet tandem, one leading, the other shadowing as if drawn by memory or instinct, not command. The herd stood just beyond the outer line, partially obscured by brush and morning haze. They did not move until she neared. Then, slowly, they stepped forward, forming around her and the calf without urgency or resistance. The oldest female took the left. Two younger bulls folded in behind. No noise passed between them, only the silent rearrangement of space, as if accepting her without question, as if no time had passed since she had last stood among them. Kamari stepped forward. Not far, just enough that she might see him. She stopped once, turned her head not fully, just a glance, not of thanks, not of sorrow, just recognition, the kind that doesn't ask for more. Then she turned again and walked on. The calf stayed close to her side. Its gait was uneven, still learning its rhythm. But it did not stray. She didn't guide it. She didn't check behind. The others shifted slightly to allow room. As they disappeared into the distant thornveld, the herd closed around them like trees closing a path. Kamari didn't follow. There was no need. He remained near the post where she had waited, where she had once pressed her body into silence and grief. Now it stood empty, marked only by shallow grooves in the soil and the faint scent of dust and sweat. He crouched and touched the earth where her trunk had once rested. It was still damp beneath the surface. His fingers pressed lightly into the place she had not left for days. What had once been a site of refusal was now a trace of decision. She had stayed. She had remembered. And then, when it mattered, she had chosen to go. He stood and looked once toward the horizon, where the herd was no longer visible. Only a faint movement of leaves gave any sign they had passed. The breeze lifted briefly, carrying the scent of wild grass and distant rain. Kamari did not speak. There was nothing to say. The fence held its shape behind him, and beyond it, the morning opened wide and quiet. Morning broke slow and colorless, the kind that holds its light low to the ground, gentle and unsure. There was no breeze yet. The trees stood in still outlines, shadows not quite separating from the trunks that cast them. Kamari walked alone, his steps quiet along the edge of the worn track, where soft soil still bore impressions from the night before. He did not follow a trail. He followed the memory. He stopped where the earth dipped beside the fence, the hollow she had pressed into with her body for nearly 3 days. The post stood unchanged, its base polished smooth by the slow repetition of her waiting. Around it, the grass had been flattened, bent back with the shape of her stillness. A few scattered prints remained, faint but visible, pressed shallow and wide into the clay. The calf's smaller marks crossed through them, uneven and quick. Kamari lowered himself without speaking, one knee to the ground. His hand brushed across the surface of the dirt where her trunk had once rested. It was dry now. The rain had long soaked through, and the topsoil flaked in thin curls beneath his fingertips. He did not search for signs. There was nothing more to find. She was gone, and it had not an ending. She had not come for comfort, not for rescue. She had come to complete something. What had been torn in fire and fear had been touched again, not to be repaired, but remembered. She had not needed to stay. She had chosen to. And when she had felt him close enough, not in distance but in presence, she had turned and left without fear. That was what had changed. The clearing was nearly silent, save for the brittle shift of leaves high in the acacia branches and the dry murmur of insects waking with the heat. A single dove passed overhead without calling. From the west, thin dust stirred across the plain, rising briefly before falling back. Kamari stood. His body ached, not from exertion, but from the stillness he had held for so long. He walked to the edge of the fence and paused once more, hand resting lightly against the post. There had been days not long ago when he had wondered what role he played in the lives he touched briefly, the calves that passed through the holding corrals and into the bush or the earth. Now he had seen the answer arrive, wordless and slow. She had come back, just once, not to demand, not to explain, but to be seen, and to see. He hadn't known what to expect from her return. He only knew he would have waited longer if she hadn't come. The land before him was open now. No herd in sight, no calf prints, only wind passing through the short grasses and shallow waves. But there was no absence. The space she had occupied was full, not with sound, but with the shape of something completed. Kamari turned from the fence. There was no patrol planned that day, no file to complete, and nobody to tend. His steps were slow, not weary, just deliberate. His shoulders moved with each breath, unhurried, unburdened. Behind him, the hollow by the post held its shape a little longer, the curve of her body still marked by bent grass and shadow. Then the wind rose just enough to stir the upper leaves, and with it came the quiet hush of things being carried forward.